The World Bank's safeguard policies are supposed to prevent harm to communities and the environment in bank lending, but they do not adequately protect human rights. For example, the World Bank will not lend to projects that might violate a country's international environmental commitments, but it can ignore a country's international human rights commitments. The lack of clear rules on human rights means that bank staff have unfettered discretion to decide whether human rights matter, whether they need to do anything about them, and whether they will even tell senior management or the board members if there are problems. This has led to World Bank financing services in places like Vietnam's drug detention centers, without acknowledging or bringing to the board's attention that people, including children, are being arbitrarily detained in these centers, used for forced labor, and punished for not working. Sometimes these punishments amount to torture. President Kim's recent public statements on the impact of discrimination on development and his assurance that people should not face discrimination in bank-financed health programs in Uganda because of a draconian law against LGBT people is a positive step. But now President Kim and the bank need to implement the reforms necessary within the World Bank to ensure respect for human rights for all of its programs. The World Bank's review of the safeguards is an opportunity for the bank to do that, to undertake human rights due diligence in order to ensure that it doesn't contribute to violations around the world. In Ethiopia, the World Bank has provided a $2 billion project for education, health, sanitation, rural roads, and agricultural services. These are all positive aims, but the government forcibly relocated some of the 1.5 million indigenous and other marginalized people affected by the program from Gambela and other regions to new villages where they're supposed to receive those services. State security forces there repeatedly threatened, assaulted, and arbitrarily arrested villagers who didn't want to move. Human Rights Watch ourselves documented at least 7 cases of people who were beaten to death by the military in the Gambela region. Human Rights Watch also learned of many other allegations of such deaths during our 2011 research, focusing on the first year of this program. This is an untenable situation generally, and especially when U.S. taxpayer funds support the institution financing these programs. If the World Bank had mandatory human rights rules requiring basic due diligence, it could have done things differently in Ethiopia. It could have identified the risks of arbitrary detention, torture, and killings associated with the project, and it could have mitigated those risks. It did not, and its staff will not acknowledge that this has happened, despite hearing about the problems directly from witnesses and victims. It's not the first time it's happened, though. We documented how Ethiopian government discriminated against people in bank-funded programs who the government felt did not support the ruling party in the lead-up to their elections. Instead of impartially providing aid and government assistance to the poor on the basis of need, the government penalized opposition supporters. Now imagine if the US government decided one day that only Democrats or only Republicans could receive social services or access to government programs. That might be a problem here, but that is exactly what has happened in Ethiopia. And again, when we pointed out this to the World Bank, they denied it on the basis of a desk study while acknowledging that it would probably take a full field investigation, like the one we had already done, to actually find out what was happening on the ground. And in all of these cases, the bank could have, should have known about these problems, but chose not to and had no rules in place that meant it had to. With carefully implemented reforms, the World Bank can respect human rights while ending extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity, even in the most complex human rights environments. Other development institutions have started to recognize their human rights obligations, but the bank has fallen behind. The Safeguards Review is an opportunity to change that, and the U.S. has an opportunity to lead with its values. U.S. leadership would empower bank staff to proactively tackle human rights issues and ensure real poverty alleviation occurs. But it won't be easy. There are governments, led by China, that are trying to thwart any mention of human rights or any policy that might protect them at the bank, and their views have a lot of influence within the institution. If the U.S. is silent or inconsistent, those governments will likely prevail with new safeguards that are absent of rights. We've heard bank staff and other board members recently describe the U.S. position on human rights as, quote, unclear, unquote. Even though U.S. law recognizes human rights as central to development policy and requires the United States to use its voice and vote in international financial institutions, including the World Bank, to advance human rights. Congress has required the U.S. to protect human rights. The 2014 appropriations required the U.S. to oppose development financing for activities that directly or indirectly involve forced evictions in Ethiopia, for example. That showed great leadership, and we believe that U.S. leadership will be crucial for the safeguards. We would urge Congress to push the administration through its budget hearings, through appropriations legislation, and direct conversations and correspondence to advocate strongly for the World Bank to 1, require respect for human rights, 2, prohibit discrimination of all protected categories under international law, 3, undertake human rights due diligence, 4, ensure the existing safeguards on resettlement and indigenous people meet international human rights standards, 5, apply safeguard policies to all activities of the World Bank, including all lending mechanisms and through technical advice, and finally, increase monitoring and supervision of bank programs.